Being on the internet relies on a presupposition of certain ideas of pleasure. You can supposedly get an instant hit of enjoyment in a vast variety of ways, but some forms of enjoyment are, by the nature of the internet providers, the content providers, restricted. It's an illusion that you have access to every form of enjoyment, because the major social media portals all have agreements that, at least on paper, force people to give up some of their rights when they're uploading content. This means that if you want to really have a sense of enjoyment that comes from someone willingly giving you something, you can't really experience that to its full extent. Marriage is supposedly a pleasure bond. It's a relationship entered into, at least at some stage, presumably, because the people enjoyed being with each other, and which would imply, in order to have full enjoyment, that there has to be consent. Somebody can't be forced into entering into a marriage and has to agree to it if it's going to be a proper one. And there has to be informed consent. Informed consent is quite dramatically missing from the major interactions in the Bible. Adam and Eve are looking for information. They don't know what they're consenting to, and they seek the knowledge to try and find that out. They aren't told, if you eat from this tree, you're going to become pregnant with several gods, and it's going to be very agonizing for you. This is a reworking of the story of Enki in the Sumerian stories, who ate from a tree that made him pregnant with multiple gods, almost killed him, and he had to be saved by a female goddess. There's no pre-discussion of what the contract is going to entail. There's no disclosure to Adam and Eve that there's a second tree of life. They don't know it's there. They don't know that after Eve has given birth to one of these gods' offspring, that it's going to kill her own offspring. As we move farther along, the story of Abraham is in many ways defined by various models of consent, what is and what isn't. And as I mentioned in my last video, some of the most hidden ideas of what's behind Abraham have to do with the simple idea of being. Can we be what we want? Are we told what we can be? And do we fully consent to it? In the Ten Commandments, I got started looking this up because I wondered if the word have means a marital relationship. This is often used in relationship between gods and people in the Old Testament in order to describe how it's supposed to work. So I wondered, is this a metaphor for a sexual marital relationship between people and God, as in to have and to hold when people get married? So I went and looked up the transliteration from the Hebrew of what the word have was meant to mean. Would it mean, for instance, something like worship? But it didn't mean that. The verb was not to worship or to have. It was to be, to become, to come to pass, or simply to be. This means that when Yehovah says, "You will have no other gods before me," it's been not fully, completely, literally translated. It means you will be no other gods before me. This means that you're commanded to be a god. This throws all the other commandments out the window. Because if you're going to emulate what Yehovah is, that means breaking all the other commandments, because they're all the commandments that he personally pretty much has broken. One of the most dramatic ones is the Sabbath. Yehovah, after the first 6 days, which he might have taken part in as a member of the Elohim, a family creation of the first 6 days, went out and moonlighted, started up his own creation on the seventh day. He worked on the seventh day to make Adam and Eve and all the other things around them, in the reverse order in many cases, from the first 6-day creation in Genesis 1. So to go out and work on the Sabbath then is to both emulate Yehovah and risk being punished for it. It's a very complex set of rules, much like the sanctimonious pirate in Scene 1, Act 2 of Measure for Measure, where Shakespeare says the pirate went to the sea with the 10 Commandments, and acting like he was upholding them as he did his work. But of course he had to scrape one off the table, because as a pirate he couldn't obey one of the commandments which said not to steal. Well, there's a whole lot more being violated than that in this case, if you are going to be like Yehovah. In one of the prime events of breaking the commandment, which is thou shalt not commit adultery, if we take that in the marital sense, literally, you don't do certain things with other men's wives. Of course, Yehovah breaks this commandment because he does it with Sarah. And this is essentially when it's hinted at that this is what's going to be done, she says, am I to receive pleasure? This is a very sad thing for a woman to have to say, who's almost 90. The most desired woman, arguably, in the Bible. She's desired by at least 2 kings and 2 gods. Does not know what pleasure is. She doesn't know what pleasure is because she's never been asked. She's been taken against her will. First time, of course, by Pharaoh. And Abraham says that they'll kill me when they see how beautiful you are. So he makes an agreement. He gets more livestock in exchange for allowing the Pharaoh to take Sarah, as if she were a piece of livestock as well. Yehovah comes down on Pharaoh. Hint of what's going to happen later on in Exodus. Throws a bunch of plagues at him. Pharaoh gives up in disgust and kicks them out. But Abraham gets to keep the loot. Each time a member of his family is taken by other people and he gets those people back, Abram at this point ends up richer. And the greatest moment of triumph is when 5 kings of his neighborhood are defeated by 4 outsiders, and then Abraham defeats the people who defeated his local kings and took Lot and all of his possessions with him. So he ends up on this combined pile of loot from 9 kings. And Abram at this point is probably finally thinking, I'm free, I can do what I want, I can dispense of this wealth as I see fit, and I don't have to let someone else mistreat me first in order to make money. So, at this moment, he decides perhaps that he's going to be magnanimous. He's going to be a giver instead of having to trick other people into giving him stuff who are more powerful than he is. This time, he's the powerful one. So, what does he do? He gives 10% of all the loot to the priest of Melchizedek. This is a horrible humiliation, as I would see it, for the king of Sodom. He's just been taken captive. All of his people have been taken captive and all their wealth. And he's been forced to have 10% of that wealth given away against his consent, without his consent. But he still tries to reward Abraham. He says, take all the goods, but let me keep the people. Which I would see as not necessarily an evil thing at all. It's a lot more trouble to have to keep on dealing with your people afterwards in those circumstances, when everybody's been so humiliated and impoverished and defeated. But Abraham, at the one time when he could conceivably do anything, obeys one thing that he's been told by Yehovah, and that is to not take anything, not so much as a sandal thong, from the king of Sodom. Because in doing so, Yehovah would, in a sense, have to bless the king of Sodom. He blesses those who bless Abraham. He has promised this. He would confer some degree of righteousness, or recognize some degree of righteousness in what is presumably an utterly evil man. And so when Abraham tries to be above these worldly concerns and be generous and not impoverish anyone else. That is the thing that seals the doom of Sodom, because they can't claim that they've helped Abraham in any way, and therefore have a degree of righteousness and deserve to be saved. This is revealed much to Abraham's great horror later on, when Jehovah comes and says that Sarah is going to have her child. This no sooner comes to pass than he starts describing to Abraham how Sodom is about to be wiped out. And Abraham does one of the most remarkable things of anyone in the Bible. He haggles with Jehovah. He says, "What? You can't destroy the righteous with the wicked. Well, suppose there are X number of men remaining, 50 men remaining, who are righteous. Will you destroy them?" And he negotiates his way down to 10, so that what tilts the scales one way or another is whether Lot and his family remain in Sodom. If they stay, the people live. If they leave, they die. And the angels from the Lord drag Lot and his people out of Sodom, condemning them to death. Lot haggles, just like Abraham did, to allow him to save the people of Zoar, a small city, seemingly inconsequential, outside of Sodom and Gomorrah. So this is like the flood all over again. And just a select group of people who are saved while everyone else is wiped out. Do they really have any choice in the matter? They would have been a whole lot better if Sarah had been sent into Sodom and the king of Sodom had taken her against her will, and then they'd had to pay reparations like the Egyptians. Then at least they would have been horribly afflicted, and a good number of them might have been killed off by plagues, but at least some of them would have survived. And you can see this anger and the sense of, what are we, chopped liver? They just get Lot. They don't get the most beautiful woman in the immediate world to come into their community. They just get like the lesser version of Abraham's relatives, and they try to make the best of it in a particularly vindictive and angry way, and are ultimately punished for it. And after this, Abraham seems to go back to his previous ways. He goes to Abimelech, another king, and says the same thing, that Sarah is his sister, and triggers a whole set of events in which he's once again sort of loaning out his wife. But through all this, there's a feeling of what other choice is there? If Abraham doesn't pimp his wife out, the people who don't get her are wiped off the face of the earth. So that's a big thing to have on your conscience if you simply keep your wife to yourself under those circumstances. So there's a lot of difficulties with this concept of consent. In all the major supernatural births, the woman never asked. She's never said, "Oh, by the way, would you like to be the mother of a bunch of gods?" Or, "Would you like to be the mother of God's child who's going to be the forerunner of this long succession of kings and nations?" Or, "Would you like to be the mother of the Messiah?" None of them are ever asked. And we can't see in this veil of the internet, I think, what enjoyment we could have if we could be asked and could say no or could say yes. I've had a number of offers for my material, but they always involve sacrificing my rights in some way. And I've had people who've given me shout-outs that haven't forfeited my rights. But it is a rare thing indeed to be asked, and it's a whole new realm of enjoyment when it happens.